Welcome, everyone. I'm Giacomo De Andres, a PhD candidate at Torino, and I'll be chairing this third and final meeting of this year's round of the Shelves. For those of you who are new to the format, the Shelves is a series of presentations of CUP volumes organized by the group Filosofia Antica Torino, which includes, in addition to myself, Giulia De Cesaris, Laura Marongiu, and Federico Petrucci, with the support of Cambridge University Press. Cambridge University Press is offering a 40% discount on any of the volumes presented in this series. And to obtain this discount, you can email Michael Sharp and mention that you attended today's event. His contact details should be shared in the chat. Okay. So we're thrilled to conclude this year's round of the shelves with a presentation of Robert Roreitner's Aristotle on the nature and causes of perception. The plan for today is fairly simple. We will begin with a general introduction to the volume by Robert himself. Then Mike Arsenault and Katerina Ierodiakonou will discuss some of the book's key themes and arguments. Finally, we will open the floor for general discussion, if time permits. Before handing over to our speakers, let me briefly introduce them. Robert Roreitner is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Charles University, Prague. Michael Arsenault is Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. Katerina Ierodiakonou is Associate Professor in Ancient Philosophy at the University of Geneva and Professor in Ancient Philosophy at the University of Athens. Robert, Mike, and Katerina share broad research interests in ancient philosophy of mind, especially theories of perception, from the pre-Socratics to philosophers of the Imperial Age, with a particular focus on Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition. So, thank you, Robert, Mike, and Katerina, for being here with us today. We are really, really glad to have you. And Robert, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Giacomo, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to the entire Filosofia Antica group, Federico, Giulia, and Laura, for inviting me and for organizing this whole series of the shelves. It's a wonderful project, I think, and I'm extremely glad and honored to be included. And I want to thank especially warmly to Katerina and Mike for agreeing to comment on the book. So I understand I should say a bit in 10 minutes or so about the genesis of the book and how I arrived at some of its central claims. So the book is the result of what was originally conceived as the first preparatory part of a larger project concerned with the receptivity and passivity of both perceptual and rational cognition. And I guess I have since long been intrigued by Aristotle's repeated claim that perceiving and thinking, knowing, not just involve some passive processes, but are themselves cases of being affected, paschein, by their objects. And I wanted to understand what this can mean and what it can tell us about the nature of these acts, the nature of the cognitive soul, how we humans can cognize the world around us, and what we really are, according to Aristotle. But the first task was really to understand whether it makes any good sense to say that perceiving and even thinking are ways of being affected, and so they are essentially passive. One can easily be led to think that Aristotle cannot mean what he's saying, that he must only mean to say that the activities of perceiving and thinking presuppose or involve some passive processes. And that's indeed how Aristotle's claims have often been reinterpreted, I would say. But it turns out that the opposition between active and passive, implicit in this reaction, is historically determined. And I think we can trace it back to late antiquity and see that it is foreign to Aristotle. So Aristotle has no problem with saying that a passive process, paschein, is a kind of activity, energeia. And less trivially, there is nothing that would a priori exclude the idea of something being a non-processual, non-kinetic, or complete activity, and yet being essentially passive. A case of paschein, which is a teleia energeia. And the central hypothesis of the project has been that this is not just an abstract conceptual possibility, but that it is a central claim of the de anima that the primary kinds of perception and thought just are complete passive activities. So as said, the book focuses on perception because that's where Aristotle starts, and there turns out to be more than enough to ask and explore here. It can be roughly divided into two main parts, loosely corresponding to the two conjuncts in the title, which is also how Katerina and Mike divided their presentations. So the first part, chapters 1, 2, and 3, focuses on how Aristotle motivates and develops what I argue can be labeled as the concept of complete passive activities. And the key text here is the much discussed De Anima 2.5, but I also pay attention to how Aristotle's first account of perception in the chapter is responding to difficulties raised by Aristotle and Theophrastus against the accounts of earlier thinkers. And I'm also interested in how the notion developed in De Anima 2.5 relates to kindred texts like Physics 3.1 and 2, Nicomachean Ethics 10.4, or Metaphysics Theta 6. So with regard to predecessors, there is one difficulty formulated by Aristotle that I emphasize more than the others. And it runs roughly as follows. If perceiving X essentially involves becoming like X, how does perceiving X differs from just retaining a perceptual trace of X? And this, I argue, is exactly where the claim that perceiving is a way of being affected by the perceived object becomes central. But that raises another question. How can the perceiver be like X and yet continue being affected by X, given that, according to Aristotle and many of his predecessors, Y can only be affected by X if Y is in the relevant respect unlike X? So the case of perception seems to strain Aristotle's standard analysis of Paschein in kinetic terms. And this is one of the reasons, I argue, why he finds it important to show how perception can be both passive and complete. So the completeness of perception, which is manifested most notoriously, but not exclusively, in that I'm simultaneously perceiving and have perceived the same object, turns out to be central to Aristotle's inquiry in De Anima, rather than falling outside it, as has been famously argued. And so the achievement of Aristotle's first account in De Anima 2.5 on my interpretation is to show how passivity and completeness of perception must be integrated. But that account remains in several important respects preliminary and programmatic. Most importantly, it doesn't say anything about how the body and the soul are respectively involved in perception. And that is where the second part of the book starts. It discusses several central notions of, several central notions that Aristotle introduces later in the Anima, perceptual discrimination in chapter 6, the concept of receiving forms without the matter in chapter 7, or the role of perceptual media in chapter 4. And in chapter 4, I also briefly address the notorious issue about what happens in the body of a perceiver. And a thread which is running through all these chapters is a set of questions concerning the role of the perceptive soul. And I say just a bit about the organs and then about the soul. So in retrospect, I see the book as a part of a trend of shifting the attention away from the much discussed question as to whether Aristotle is a literalist or spiritualist or thinks that perception involves transduction to other questions. But the book also has something to say about this debate on the way. My suggestion is that one option failed to be considered within it, and that some version of it is likely to capture Aristotle's view. Very roughly, the idea is that we must carefully distinguish between the tenses of Paschein, that is, between the way something is being affected, present tense, and the result thereof, which can be expressed in the perfect tense. And we can then say that perceptive organs are being affected in a perfectly material, perceiver-independent way, just like any other body of the given kind, but that if perception is to take place, this acting must never result in a material assimilation. So for instance, If I am to perceive a cold snowball, my organ must surely not become literally cold. In fact, that would be literally the end of me. Rather, as a result of the perfectly real and literal and perceiver-independent cooling of my body, the organ must receive the coldness in a different way, and Aristotle would say in a formal way. It must receive the form of the cold snowball while its matter remains outside in the world. Regarding the perceptive soul, that's a point where I found it most helpful to engage with ancient commentators, followers, and critics of Aristotle. And they seem to have been very much concerned with a dilemma about the perceptive soul. And the dilemma can be very roughly expressed as a triad of commitments on Aristotle's part that are mutually inconsistent, or that seem to be mutually inconsistent. First, the soul is the primary cause of perception. Second, perception is a kind of being affected. And third, soul is impassive. The two mainstream solutions, which have both ancient roots, are based on denying either the second or the third commitment, either passivity of perception or impassivity of the soul. But each of these strategies, I argue, is both exegetically and philosophically very problematic. By the way, the strategy based on denying passivity can, I think, be traced back to the non-Aristotelian opposition between paschain and energein, which is becoming dominant in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So what I attempt to do, especially in the last two chapters, is to develop an interpretation under which all the three commitments can be preserved. And a central idea here is that the soul may be involved in perception as a specific Aristotelian kind of efficient cause comparable to arts. And so occurrent perceptions turn out to be, for Aristotle, unconscious applications of a kind of inborn measuring art. And I am quick to admit that this is much less explicit in the text than I would like it to be. And I expect we will discuss some aspects of the proposal. But I argue that it is at least one possible way to preserve all of Aristotle's key commitments, which we definitely should try to preserve. And with that, I pass the word to Katarina and Mike, thanking them again for kindly accepting to do this.
Okay, I mean, let me also start by thanking the organizers. I mean, it was a good chance to read the book from beginning to end. Usually we read chapters of books or articles, but never a book from beginning to end. Not never, but a lot of times we avoid doing that. So it was nice to have the chance to read the whole of the book, and it was a book that I wanted to read very much. Now, Robert's book deals with the, I think, deceptively simple question, what is perception according to Aristotle? That is how Aristotle explains the most basic acts of perceiving. And I say deceptively simple question because this question has famously enough been at the center of many heated debates among contemporary scholars, as Robert, of course, is well aware of it. And that's why he trots very carefully in his attempt to give a satisfactory answer to the question, what is perception according to Aristotle? Now, in this book, Robert, the way I read it at least, attempts to unify three aspects of perception as described by Aristotle. The causal aspect, perceiving is being affected by external objects. The relational aspect, perceiving is a relation between perceivers and external objects. And the qualitative aspect, perceiving, involves the assimilation of a quality by the perceiver. But the central problem, I think, that drives the whole book and aims to resolve it is, I think, how perception can be considered as passive, given that perceiving is being affected by external objects, if the soul, in Aristotle's view, cannot be acted upon and undergo any change, given that the soul is understood as an unmoved causal principle. So Robert signals his solution early on, namely that perception should be regarded as a complete passive activity. And that's the topic of the first 3 chapters that I would like to comment on. But before that, can I say some nice things about the book? Because I do think that it is conceptually rich, painstakingly argued, lucid, well-structured. It elucidates obscure core Aristotelian passages and suggests sophisticated interpretation. I think it is an excellent book, which makes it very difficult to find points of criticism, if this is in fact my role here, but I will try my best. So I will make some remarks about these 3 first chapters and the introduction. They're going to be mainly clarificatory, also historical, and you will realize that they have to do with my own interests in the subject of sense perception. So let me start with a comment concerning something which Robert says at the beginning of the introduction. And in fact, he mentioned that also now in his summary of his book, or whatever, of the genesis of the book. So in his discussion of the concept of passive activities, I found quite persuasive his arguments that we do not have here a contradiction in terms, as our modern notion of passivity would suggest, since, as he says, we tend to treat activity and passivity as mutually exclusive opposites. Aristotle, on the other hand, uses 2 separate distinctions, namely between poiein and pasien on the one hand, and between energeia and dyname on the other, treating poiein and pasien as 2 aspects of energeia, of activity. So Robert wants us to shed some of our deeply ingrained intuitions about passivity and activity, as he says in the conclusion of the book. Now, in this context, I really appreciated Robert's pursuit to trace the origins of how, in the opposition between poiein and passion, the notion of energein gradually replaced that of poiein. For according to Robert, the adjective energetikos replaced, perhaps for the first time, that of poetikos in the works of the Hellenistic grammarians, when introducing the distinction of the voices of verbs between the energetike voice and the pathitike voice. Okay, but I wonder, though, whether the Hellenistic grammarians made such a distinction under the influence of philosophical views at the time. So whether it is the grammarians who introduced this, or there is some sort of philosophical background behind it. Now, Marwan Rashid suggests, as Robert says in note 40 of the introduction, Boethus of Sidon. In fact, it is Boethus, not Boethius, as there is a type, a type there, which is pretty bad. So Boethus of Sidon is what the commentator, the peripatetic commentator, what Marwan Rashid suggested as the person behind this kind of distinction. That's page 14, Robert. Now, but let me make another suggestion, although I admit that it is mere speculation and one needs to do some further research to become serious, this suggestion, and more convincing. Now, given the well-known interest in the tenses of Stoic verbs by the Stoics, so sorry, I have to bring in the Stoics, and for which we have adequate evidence that they were really interested in this, in grammar. I was thinking whether it may be again the Stoics who influenced the Hellenistic grammarians in connections with the voices of the verbs, and in particular with the distinction between active and passive voice. I think the middle voice is also very interesting because of the reflective thing that it implies, but I don't have anything to say about that, and Robert doesn't discuss it. So in fact, searching through very quickly through the uses of energeia in Stoic fragments, I found, for instance, that when Origen describes the difference, according to the Stoics, between substance, ousia, and qualities, substance is presented as passive, patheten, not pathetiken, but patheten, while the qualities are presented as poiesis and as well as energeia. And there are other passages in Galen, Alexander, and Clement in which Stoic views are presented and in which pathemata are contrasted to energeia and poiein is presented as equivalent to energeia. Someone, of course, could immediately object, that's what I would have done, that these are later sources and the notions these authors used were not Stoic, but influenced by later developments. Still, I think it would be worth to study closely such texts and look into the possibility of a Stoic influence. And this means that one certainly needs to inquire into the philosophical reasons which could have urged the Stoics to replace poiein with energein, and thus to contrast energein with passion. But needless to say, I didn't expect Robert to undertake such an endeavor in this book. That was not his topic. But since he mentioned the Hellenistic grammarians, I thought I should look a bit further. Still, I have also a question I would like to ask concerning this opposition between energetikos and pathetikos, which we find endorsed, as Robert tells us, both in Galen and the Intellectu, Mantissa too. Now, if we leave aside Galen's case, which is perhaps easier to explain, I mean, Galen can be influenced by other people and whatever. And if we accept the view that Mantissa too is written by Alexander of Rhodesias, which is the established view, I think it is legitimate to ask, how come that Alexander makes such a mistake and denies, as Robert says, unambiguously what Aristotle repeatedly asserted, namely that perception should be considered as passive, being affected by external objects. Robert returns to this point at chapter 5.3, in which he discusses more in detail Alexander's interpretation of Aristotle, according to which perception cannot be considered as passive. That's Alexander's way of dealing with it. As Robert says, Alexander corrects Aristotle in this case. Was Alexander also influenced by the Hellenistic grammarians' distinctions? I mean, I would find that a bit doubtful. What Robert says is partly. I mean, he doesn't say that's the only thing. So I wondered, because maybe I didn't follow what Robert says, I wanted to know what would be the philosophical reasons that would urge Alexander to give such a different interpretation than the one he wants to follow. And one small remark, I mean, do we find anywhere in the Aristotelian corpus that Aristotle describes perception as energeia? I mean, I know that at the beginning of 2.5, he's going to say that perception is ento kinesthai, kai paschein. So this kinesthai, I mean, you are going to say that energeia should be understood in a much more broad sense. That's what you say. So it's so maybe this entokinesthai would be some sort of indication that there is some sort of energeia there, but that's not a good argument. I'm not saying that this is decisive, but I was wondering whether we ever find that sort of characterization of perception in Aristotle as energeia, if we want to go with the suggestion that it is a complete passive activity. Okay. I mean, I will continue, but I thought maybe you want to say something before I say my poem. Yeah.
Thank you so much. the observation about possible Stoic background is really helpful. I had it in mind that there might be some, but I just didn't feel secure enough to inquire into the sources. Partly because, as you say, the what we have really is later, and there is this hermeneutical question whether this kind of distinction was there. Early in the third or second centuries BC, but I think it's definitely something to inquire into. And so I guess you raised two questions. So what would be a philosophical reason for Alexander to deny that perception is a kind of paschain and say that it only presupposes paschain, but that it itself is energeia or energein or krinein, he says sometimes. And so that's something that he says not only in the Intellectu but also in his De Anima more than once. And I do try to bring out some philosophical reasons that might be behind this decision. So it's not just that he was influenced by grammarians. That wouldn't be a good explanation, really. But I see him as struggling with this dilemma about the role of the perceptive soul that I find important. And he seems to be committed to taking the arguments Aristotle formulates in De Anima 1, 3, and 4 against the Platonic view of soul as self-moving, and in general against the idea that soul could be the subject in its own right of any kind of being moved or being affected very sort of seriously. And I think he's right in doing that. And so he is strongly committed to the idea that the soul cannot be the subject of being affected. But if soul cannot be the subject of being affected, as, for example, Themistius would say later, how is it that it is the primary cause of perception? And I think that he just sees the idea that perception is something different than being affected. He says krinein, which is occasioned or maybe somehow caused by this passive process, as the most plausible view. And it's a sort of fair way to deal with the dilemma. The problem is that Aristotle really seems to say repeatedly the contrary of what Alexander says. But I think there is a sort of intelligible pressure on him to do something like that.
But that's the kind of pressure that you had, Robert, or everyone who
Right.
reads it has. But what is interesting is that he goes that direction. And I suppose, I'm not saying that Alexander, okay, he's the best commentator maybe when it comes to these things, but it doesn't mean that he is the person who can interpret Aristotle better than anyone else. But it's interesting that he doesn't want to but that he goes that direction. This particular person, not anyone. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I take it very seriously. I think Alexander is great.
Yes, I
But
know.
he's not infallible.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And the second question was about texts where Aristotle would say that perception is activity. And the two most obvious texts that I can think about are Nicomacheanetics 10.4 and the second half of Metaphysics Theta 6. But of course, it's controversial whether what Aristotle says there, this tense test that he introduces there, has anything to do with his scientific inquiry, as Miles Barnett would put it, that starts in De Anima. And indeed, Miles Barnett argued that this is something to be reserved to texts like the Homogeneous Ethics or Theta 6 second part, which does not, by the way, belong to Metaphysics Theta, etc. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, it depends on how we interpret particular passages in the Anima 2.5, especially where Aristotle says that either let's say or we are, let's talk or we are talking in a certain way that sort of identifies the Energein and Paschain, and that's I think that should be interpreted differently, rather as making the idea that perception is an energeia a central focus rather than putting it aside. Yeah.
Because otherwise it would be strange if that's what it is. Why wouldn't he, in the main text where he discusses perception, he doesn't clarify this and he leaves it to these other texts to make the point? So one would expect, yeah, but it's Aristotle. Yeah, okay. Okay, I don't want to take the whole time, and we are all going, we are going very, and I mean, I was thinking of talking about the first chapter, a bit the second chapter, and make comments about it. But let me focus then on a couple of things instead of going in more detail through the three first chapters that I was supposed to present. And I wanted to talk a bit about this principle that you are discussing, mainly in the second chapter. The like is affected by like. I mean, a very small point again. I mean, you talk about then like is affected by like, then like is known by like. But I was wondering sometimes whether this like is known by like is a bit misleading instead of like is perceived by like. I understand that you want to take known in a more broad sense, but you know, the main thing that you're discussing is perception, so I would be happy, but that's not the important thing. What I found interesting, again, it's a historical point, is the way that Aristotle treats Democritus and the way that Theophrastus treats Democritus. Because as you say that Aristotle in on generation and corruption 1.7 is going to say that Democritus clearly defends this principle, like is affected by like. Of course, he does it as a universal thesis and not in the case of perception in particular, but one would expect that that kind of application in this case would be fine for someone like Democritus. So it's as if Aristotle presents Democritus as a defender of like, in fact, the only defender of like is affected by like, whereas in Theophrastus, I mean, you refer to the De Sensibus. In the first paragraph of the De Sensibus, when this principle is discussed, Democritus doesn't come at all into the picture. So you have Parmenides, Empedocles, Plato, but not Democritus. When he makes the distinction, there are these people who go for similarity, homoiotita, and these people who go for an antiotis. So the homoiotita is only Plato, Empedocles, and Parmenides. And it's in paragraph 49 that you refer mainly to, where he says that you can interpret Democritus both ways. I mean, you can interpret him all as someone who goes in favor of this principle, as someone who is against this principle. So there is a clear difference between Aristotle and Theophrastus on this point. And I mean, I really was wondering whether there is a more interesting reason behind, you know, that, you know, Theophrastus was more careful than Aristotle was, that people usually say. So that was one thing, if you want to comment on that. Then I was also interested in this analogy that Aristotle, as you say, is eager to emphasize between perception and the arts. Medicine is the point. I mean, the art that he's going to suggest. And the analogy works that the external object is more or less the doctor's art, and the perceiver is the patient. And I was wondering how helpful this analogy is. And I mean, you don't go into that, but I was wondering whether the doctor's art has, I mean, the doctor can both cure and he can kill with his art. So there are these two different directions that this art, these two different results that the art can have. Whereas in the case of the sense object, I mean, the sense object we just perceive. I mean, there is no and also the doctor acquires this art through through training, but we perceive as soon as we are born. I mean, there is nothing that. So, I mean, I really was wondering whether Aristotle needs to emphasize so much this sort of analogy between perception and what are you making out of it. Now, again, I'm taking too much time. So a couple of general questions we can discuss at some other point between, me and Robert, these other things. Now, you present, I mean, you try this suggestion of yours about the complete passive activity. I mean, that's how you want to present perception. I mean, this helps you in many ways, especially to deal with a problem that Mike will discuss between materialism and literalism. But you present Aristotle being very consistent, and the whole thing is, it's very, it's very tidy in a way and very neat and too neat. And of course, at the end in the appendix, you have some paragraphs that maybe would cause some problem, but you try also to suggest that there is no problem even with these paragraphs. And I was wondering, do you really believe that he is so neat, especially when it comes to other senses than the paradigmatic sense, which is vision? I mean, when it comes to hearing, and when in the case of hearing, there is these waves of air that are going to be the main reason for us, or the main reason for Aristotle, that we can hear. And so I was wondering how much you want to defend this kind. And then the other thing that I was wondering is, right from the beginning that you are interested in dealing with these very basic perceptive acts of perception. And I was wondering whether you think that this would also, your suggestion of complete passive activities would also apply for more complex acts of perception, like recognizing a whole object and not, just the color or just the proper objects of perception. Anyway, I think that I should stop here because Mike won't have any chance to say what he wants to say. I mean, thank you very much for the book. I mean, I do think that it will raise a lot of discussions, but at least I think that maybe now the discussions will be a bit more fruitful, because sometimes I feel that discussions on this issue have come to some sort of an impasse, and we don't know how to go from that. That's all.
Thank you so much, Katerina. So I should be very brief, I understand. I especially liked your question whether I believe that Aristotle is as consistent as I present him to be. I do. I do. So I think there were actually 2 points. So one is whether he is consistent in denying any passivity of the soul, which is what the appendix is about. And I really do think that in De Anima, all these passages are better read in a different way than Aristotle allowing for the soul itself being affected. Well, it can be affected kata symbebekos, but not in itself. But I cannot deny that there are passages outside the anima where he denies the impassivity of the soul. And I mean, there, the picture ceases to be entirely neat. And so one possibility is some developmental account. Another possibility is that he's just not as careful as he should be in those texts. But I mean, there it's not as neat as I maybe present it to be. I think that concerning the more complex objects or other than model-specific objects, that's something that Mike is going to ask about, so I will leave that aside. And maybe I say just about one thing, something, and that was about the comparison with arts. And so that seems to be quite central to the Anima 2.5. And I take it that Aristotle's point is that the perceptive capacity, although it is inborn, is a complete passivity, complete capacity. That is a dynamics which is at the same time entelechia of the subject, which is another way of saying that its actualization will be a complete activity on what Andreas Anagnosopoulos calls the subject criterion. So I take it that what this comparison serves for is the point that by perceiving, the perceptive capacity is in no way diminished. And for it to be in no way diminished, it has to be, perception needs to be what he calls paschein, which is a kind of soteria, not a kind of phthora, not a kind of destruction. So I think that it's really helpful for this purpose, but we should not, and I think it's sometimes done, sort of read more into this parallel that he draws in the Anima 2.5 and think that when he says that perception is a paschein, which is a kind of soteria, it means that it is perfectly comparable with arts like house building, which would not leave any place for it being passive, because these arts are productive, of course. And so I think it's just one side of what he wants to say about perception. It's a complete activity, but it's also a passive activity. And the point is to integrate the two. I'll be happy to talk about the other points, but I think I will take your suggestion that we do it at some other point to leave time for Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So thanks to the organizers for organizing this, and to Katerina for engineering such an interesting discussion so far, and to Robert for writing such a rich and insightful book, although I've come to expect that from him. So Katerina focused on the first few chapters, which deal with Robert's interpretation of Anima 2.5, which he understands as roughly giving the pre-causal job description that the account of perception in the remainder of the Anima is then supposed to fill in. I'm going to pick out a couple of topics from the second half of Robert's book, which, among other things, describes how Aristotle fills in some of those causal details in accordance with the job description that we get in Anima 2.5. So I had three themes. I'm going to focus on one, and I think we'll run out of time. So the three themes were: one, impassivity, homeostatic resistance, and the medium, tripart theme. Two, perceptual discrimination. And three, how do we reconcile the relational and the qualitative natures of perception? I'll start with a fair bit of background, but hopefully you'll sort of enjoy the tour through Robert's book, or the second half of it, and then I'll end with a dilemma. Okay. So Robert emphasizes that one of Aristotle's innovations when it comes to perception is the idea that even though perception is a kind of affection, the soul remains unaffected or impassive in perception. So while pointing out that the perceptual soul might be impassive in various ways, I mean, for example, Aristotle says in Metaphysics Zeta that forms are unaffected in general, and the soul is a form, so it's unaffected. Right? There might be lots of ways in which the soul is unaffected. But he highlights one more interesting way, namely that the soul is impassive in the sense that it has a power for resisting a certain kind or range of acting. So drawing on the idea that complete passive activities of the sort we were just talking about allow for the kind of continuous affection that is required for bouts of continuous perceiving, Robert points out that, quote, throughout the time of perceiving F, the respective organ must remain F in capacity. Indeed, to continue being affected, and so perceiving, the organ must remain unlike the object, that is, not F in fulfillment. Okay. So this is where the sort of causal story comes in, if I can put it like that. So Robert argues that the soul acts to keep the organ in a neutral and so receptive condition, despite the onslaught of incoming effects from the perceptual object, by counterbalancing those incoming effects. So the perceptual object pushes, as it were, the organ toward one extreme, say the red extreme, and then the soul pushes back toward the other extreme to counterbalance those incoming effects, with the result that the organ stays in the neutral and so receptive condition. So this is a kind of homeostatic mechanism, but it's also a way of being impassive, that is, of resisting a certain kind of change in the organ. So notice two things. So one, as is important for Robert, and this is something that I think he does a great job of bringing out, it looks like the perceptual soul is acting as an efficient causal partner in perception here, alongside the object of perception, right? So it's not supplanting the object as the efficient cause, but it looks like it's doing some efficient causal work, as Aristotle does seem to say in De Anima. Notice too that this homeostatic pushback doesn't just explain why the organ remains neutral and so receptive. It also helps to explain how perceptual discrimination works. Think of an equal arm balance or scale, as Robert suggests himself. You put the thing you want to measure on one side of the balance, and then you measure it by counterbalancing it with a weight on the other side. So now, were it not for this homeostatic pushback on the part of the soul, Robert suggests that we would lose contact with the external world because our eyes, for example, would actually take on the relevant quality, whether that means actually becoming red or maybe encoding the proportions that are characteristic of red, etc. And then if it did that, then we would lose contact with the world because at best we would be perceiving the quality in our eyes rather than the quality of the external object. Okay, so this is where my first and perhaps only, given the time, question comes in. Although I'm going to give you the question and then give you yet more background to make full sense of it. So here's the question. If there's a problem in the sense organ here, a threat to its neutrality, which needs to be solved by the soul's homeostatic pushback, I don't yet see why there is not also the same problem in the perceptual medium, where presumably we cannot appeal to the soul for help. So here's the extra background. So what do I mean by the perceptual medium? So strikingly, Aristotle insists that all perception requires a medium, even touch and taste, but we can set them aside. Or in other words, all perception requires a body that separates the object of perception from the corresponding sense organ, and yet mediates the relation between them. So Aristotle points out that you can't see things when you put them directly on your eye, or hear things when you shove them directly in your ear. He didn't know about earbuds. So according to Robert, a good medium, right, like the air that separates you from the apple on your desk, is a qualitative conducer in the sense that before, or maybe instead of, taking on the red quality itself from the apple, it passes the quality on to the next bit of the medium, and so on all the way to the organ. So the air that mediates my perceptual relation to the red apple, for example, doesn't become red, or take on the proportions of red, etc., except perhaps in extreme circumstances, right? But in the normal case, because it's a good qualitative conducer, it just transmits or passes on the effects of the redness without embodying that redness in the medium. If the medium did take on the quality, whatever that amounts to, Robert thinks that that would be a failure to mediate, because we would just end up perceiving the medium itself, right? The medium would be red or have the relevant proportions, etc. And we wouldn't be perceiving the red apple or the redness of the apple through the medium. Now, to see the worry behind this first question, we just need to add the fact that Aristotle argues that the sense organs are made out of the same kinds of materials as the media, in order to be susceptible of being affected by the changes in the media. So for example, the eye is made of water, and water is one of the substances that mediates vision. The receptive part of the ear is made of air, and that's one of the media for sound, etc. So here's the apparent dilemma, but I want to hear what Robert has to say. Either there's no threat of my eye becoming red, except perhaps in extreme circumstances, and so there's no need for the soul to push back, or else it looks like we will need something soul-like in the medium that keeps it from turning red, or in other words, that keeps it neutral, right? Some kind of homeostasis in the medium. But then we face concerns about why the medium doesn't count as perceiving alongside us, right? As Robert knows full well. I mean, one of the things that I like about Robert's book is that he's engaging with the kinds of problems that would have bothered Aristotle and Theophrastus rather than the problems that we bring to the text. And Theophrastus was certainly worried about, why the medium doesn't count as perceiving if the form is in there without the matter. And I think that should worry us too. Indeed, it kept me up last night. But anyway, so I'll pause there for now, and like to hear what you had to say in response, and then I think I'll pause for that.
Thank you very much. So I think this goes straight to what might be the most speculative point in the book, and that is that the homeostatic account of the soul's involvement can be extended from touch as far as to sight. And so basically, my response to Mike's dilemma would be I would embrace the first horn, or to better put it, the first part of the first horn. There is indeed no threat of my eye becoming red. Good news. But I would deny the consequent, which was that it does not mean, sorry, which was that this means that there is no need for the soul to push back. So I would agree there is no threat that the eye becomes literally red, but it doesn't mean that there is no need for the soul to push back. And so I would just say a little bit about sort of methodological issue, maybe. So I think there is a nice sort of symmetry in De Anima 2, 7 through 11. So Aristotle introduces the notion of mediation primarily for the distal senses, sight, hearing, and also smelling, of course, and then extends that notion, mutatis mutandis, to the contact senses, which is weird, which is counterintuitive, right? So there is a mediation even in the case of touch, except that the medium is a part of our body. And I think that something similar is going on in De Anima 2:11, something symmetrically reversed. So he introduces this homeostatic account primarily for touch, where it seems to make sense. So the object that I'm supposed to perceive is literally cooling my body or heating my body, and this needs to be counteracted. And that's also a way of discriminating that object. And then he extends this to also distal senses, where, again, it's counterintuitive and it's not entirely obvious what it means. And there will be some modifications to that account. And I think the key modification is that in that case, there is no threat that the organ becomes literally red. There is something else. So I think Mike and I perfectly agree that there is no threat on the side of the medium of acquiring the quality that is mediated, at least in the case of color and sound, as a quality of its own. We might not entirely agree about others, but let's leave them aside. The point is that the sounds that Mike is making, his words, are not present in the air as sounds of the air, but as Mike's sounds. But the key point, for me at least, is that they are not really present in the medium. They are only passed through the medium, or precisely mediated through the medium. They are sort of passing through it. So they are never present in the medium. And if the organ were sort of left to its own without any involvement of the soul, that would be exactly what would happen. So the sounds, Mike's wonderful words would just pass through it, but they wouldn't be present in it. And that means exactly that they would not be perceived. And that's the reason why the soul needs to be involved. Not because there's, this threat that my hearing organ could start to be sounding. I don't think that's a genuine threat, but because otherwise it would just pass through it and I wouldn't perceive the words.
Thanks.
I'm sorry to interrupt. If I had it right, Mike has something more to say, and well, I would say if you and Robert are available, we can agree to allocate some additional time to the discussion and say bring in a further topic. But I don't wanna anyone to be taken prisoner. So, Katerina, if you have to leave, please don't feel compelled to stay on.
No, I mean, I left the conference and I have to go back at some point, but I'm sorry about that, but I will have to disappear at some point, but go on.
Please feel free to do that.
Okay, well, in your honor, then, Katerina, I'll go on with just the next point, which will overlap partly with yours. So I can be much quicker here. So this is about perceptual discrimination. So we already have the fundamental underlying mechanism of perceptual discrimination on the table, at least for the core case of the perception of special perceptibles, like the visual perception of color, the auditory perception of sound, etc. Namely, perception discriminates the quality, or takes the measure of it, by adjusting the organ dynamically to counterbalance it, right? Like a scale. But Robert points out that there is much more to talk of discrimination or crinane in Aristotle's discussion of not just of perception, but of cognition more generally, than could be explained by such a mechanism. So, for example, Robert has a nice account, I think, of how we might begin to extend this core account of perceptual discrimination to the more difficult case of explaining how we discriminate darkness by sight and silence by hearing, etc., in terms of the fact that the senses are integrated into one perceptual faculty, so that I can, for example, pick out the room I'm in by feeling the air against my skin, and then judge or discriminate that it is dark by means of sight due to the absence of visual stimuli. The key point to notice is just that this is clearly working with a different mechanism, right? Because it's not like the silence of the room is pushing on the air in my ears towards one extreme, and then my soul needs to counterbalance it somehow, by like blasting music in my ears or something, right? So clearly there's a different mechanism involved here. But maybe we can extend the idea of perceptual discrimination from the core case of the perception of color to this adjacent case of the perception of darkness. But this leads me to wonder how, if at all, we should extend the notion of perceptual discrimination to other things we perceive, including the so-called common perceptibles. That is, the objects that are common to all the senses, or at least to more than one of them, like shape and motion and so on. That's why I say this is in Katerina's honor. And also to the incidental objects of perception, but I'm going to ignore them because they're very controversial. Let's focus on the commons because they are per se perceptibles at least. So Robert makes the striking observation that Aristotle doesn't use crinane language explicitly in these cases, that is, in the case of the commons and the incidentals. So there's a big question here. So maybe Aristotle thinks that talk of perceptual discrimination applies only, or only properly, to the special functions of our senses. And so the core account maybe needs to be extended to include discriminating silence by hearing, but no further, so not to squareness, for example. Or maybe it does extend, but there will have to be different mechanisms, right? So maybe the common sense or the perceptual faculty as a whole is what's in charge of discriminating the common sensibles. Again, with different mechanisms, though, right? Because we don't want to say that the cubicness of the Rubik's Cube is acting on my heart to make it more of a cube, right? And then my soul pushes back to keep it heart-shaped. So there'll be a different mechanism, right? This might be connected to another question which Robert's book raises that's quite interesting, which is why Aristotle talks so little about discrimination, and indeed about my other theme, relationality, in the De Anima, given how important most people, or at least Robert and I, agree that these themes are. So what I'm suggesting is maybe there's some kind of methodological reason why Aristotle confines or appears to confine his talk of discrimination to the special senses in the De Anima, even though maybe it's supposed to apply more broadly. It's just that Aristotle can't talk about it here. So the question is, does this account of discrimination apply more broadly to all cases of perception? And presumably different mechanisms are involved. I wonder if you have any views about that, Robert.
Yeah, thanks. That's a complex question, and it goes quite a bit beyond what is covered in the book. But I like to be pushed there. And so maybe I would say a bit about why I think that in the De Anima, so I don't claim that outside the anima he reserves crine to special perceptibles, right? But in the De Anima, that seems to be the case. And why is that? So to be brief, my answer is that he's focusing on the primary sense of perceptual discrimination, which, I mean, the way he introduces it in 2.6 shows that he sees it sort of closely connected to his infamous infallibility thesis that Mike recently published on. And I think it indeed is connected to it. So I think that roughly the question, the question whether the senses are takrinunta or criteria, as he would say in Kappa 6, or metra, as he would say elsewhere, is a question about whether the senses are the ultimate epistemic authority to decide certain kinds of questions or to cognize certain kinds of objects. And I think he wants to affirm that this is the case about the idea. But I think that he has good reasons not to extend this sort of strong, strong modal kind of discrimination to the koina, because it seems that in the case of koina, it's standardly the case that the assessments of the senses need to be corrected. So either the assessment of sight needs to be corrected by the assessment of the touch. But it seems that it's fairly standard that there are cases where, like, even if you put the assessments of the senses together, you need some correction from outside. I mean, I was thinking about, seeing or perceiving the size of the highest peak in the mountains. So obviously it's not possible to perceive it by touch, right? We would agree about it. But if you want to sort of even see the highest peak in the mountains, you need to go quite into a distance from it. But then you will not see it as the highest peak. And so you sort of need to correct your perception there. And I mean, his example of the sun, of course, is a famous one. So it appears to be 1 foot wide, but we know, or we believe, that it's larger than the inhabited world. And in that case, it seems that you just cannot perceive that. And so it seems to me that, with incidental perceptions, that will also be true from, I think, a bit different reasons. And so I think that he has good reasons to limit the sort of primary sense of discrimination in the anima to the model-specific senses. Now, but of course, he is also willing to extend it in a sort of weaker sense to the other objects. Of course, we can tell small objects from large objects and different shapes of objects quite reliably. It's not that perception is useless. And your question, I guess, was what kind of causal mechanism is responsible for that? And I don't have a ready answer to that, but I would think that the sort of starting point would have to be the observation that the discrimination of model-specific objects takes place in a spatially extended organ, and this allows for discriminating a plurality of distinct qualities simultaneously, and that I think would be what allows for discrimination of common ice theta, on the basis of a variation of the discriminated model-specific qualities across the spatial extension and across time. And I think that in the case of incidental ice theta, there will be, I mean, it's very controversial, but I would think that it can also be extended, and it's, discrimination of incidental ice theta is based on sort of singling out specific constellations, characteristic constellations of the special and common perceptible features. Yeah, I mean, it's so I'm not able to answer your question. It's just a few hints as about the way I would go.
Thanks.
Okay. I'm afraid we were running out of time. So if there are no pressing questions, I would bring the meeting to an end. But please, let me know. Okay. I see none. Let me thank Robert, Mike, and Katerina once again, as well as all of you for attending today's meeting.